The phone booth on Rue de Varini reeked of old smoke and urine. Vizimir held the receiver tight to his ear, trying to steady his trembling hand. A voice spoke in Arabic, only 3 short words. Then the line cut out without warning. He stood there for a moment, knowing he had about 90 seconds before the next metro train rolled in. He pushed open the booth door and stepped onto the street. Paris looked almost abandoned at that hour, except for a lone street cleaner moving slowly with his cart. The man wore a brown jacket, the wrong color for anyone working municipal duty. That alone put Zamir on edge. He forced himself to walk north at a calm pace, fighting the urge to sprint. Inside his coat, the decoded message pressed against his ribs. It held only one clear warning. They know you're here. The date was September 5th, 1972. Only 8 hours earlier, 11 Israeli athletes had been murdered in Munich. The shock of it still hadn't settled when Zamir was handed his orders. As director of Mossad, he had been called in by Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir, who wasted less than a minute explaining what she needed from him. Find them, kill them. Every last one. No courtroom, no requests to foreign governments, no news stories. The men behind Munich were to vanish without a trace. Zamir already had their names. 12 people tied to Black September, the ones who planned or carried out the attack on the Olympics. The list was locked inside a safe in Tel Aviv, sealed under a classification level beyond top secret. Only 7 officials in the Israeli government even knew the document existed. And yet, someone had leaked. The man in the brown jacket slipped into a narrow alley. Zamir caught the faint flash of a gun barrel reflecting light. He didn't wait. He headed down the nearest metro entrance, moving fast. The stairs dropped into harsh yellow light. His footsteps clicked against the concrete, and behind him he heard others following. 2, maybe 3 sets. His Beretta was useless to him now, sitting back in a hotel room across the Seine. The platform was already packed with morning commuters, their voices blending into a dull roar. He pushed his way through the crowd as a train approached. He needed the last car. Standard surveillance detection. See who enters behind you. The doors slid open. People shoved forward. Something touched his shoulder. Zamir spun, ready for a weapon, but found a young woman, around 25, holding out a metro ticket he must have dropped. He took it from her. She smiled, calm and unreadable. Her left hand stayed inside her purse. The door started closing. Zamir stepped away instead of boarding. The woman remained inside the car, her expression unchanged as the train carried her off. Through the window, he caught her lifting her hand from the purse. Empty. He had misjudged her. Or she had been covering for someone else. Either way, he was now in the open. He crossed to the opposite platform. The next train heading south would arrive in about 3 minutes. He scanned the area. 2 exits. One with a uniformed police officer standing near it. Not ideal. The second opened into a maintenance corridor, its metal door hanging on broken hinges. He took that route. The air inside smelled of burnt wiring and sewage. The dimness forced his eyes to adjust slowly. Ahead, the tunnel split into 3 branches. He chose the center one, hoping for a blind spot. A man waited there, holding a silenced pistol. Makarov PM, unmistakably Soviet. His face was hidden behind a kafia. "Zamir," the man said, his voice carrying a Lebanese accent. "You are far from home." Zamir lifted his hands slightly. "You have the wrong person. We studied your photograph for 3 days. You are exactly who we expected." Behind Zamir, the tunnel stretched empty and silent. No way out. He knew it, and he also knew he had just broken every rule he had spent over 2 decades drilling into recruits. Still, he kept his voice level as he asked, "Who sent you?" The man didn't answer. He moved in, slow and sure, the muzzle fixed on Zamir's chest like it belonged there. "You won't live long enough to tell anyone," he said. Zamir lifted his right hand toward his collar, his left drifting close to his belt. The stiletto sewn into the waistband sat flat against his hip, an Italian blade with roughly 4 inches of steel. To use it, he needed to close about 3 meters, and the shooter would squeeze the trigger after 2.
Black September made a mistake in Munich, Zamir said. He spoke at an even pace, stretching each word, buying fractions of a second. They started a war they cannot win. The man's reply was short. We're already winning. His finger tightened on the trigger. Zamir threw himself to the left. The shot cracked, the bullet skidding sparks off the tunnel wall. He didn't stop to think. 2 quick strides, the knife in his hand, the tip driving upward beneath the ribs. The body folded and hit the ground hard, blood pushing out across the tunnel floor in a wide, slow stain. He grabbed the fallen gun, checked the magazine, 5 rounds still inside. He searched the pockets. No papers, no name, nothing, except a small receipt from a cafe in the 11th arrondissement. It told him nothing. He headed for a service door that opened into a dim parking garage. His palms and knuckles were slick with blood. He crouched beside a puddle of rainwater and washed them until the water went pale pink. Around 20 minutes later, he sat in a taxi on the way to Charles de Gaulle Airport. The driver stayed silent. Zamir watched the streets roll by. Paris, washed in autumn light, looked calm and distant. He knew he would not see it again for roughly 15 years. On the flight back to Tel Aviv, he opened his briefcase. Inside was a single photograph.
11 faces stared back at him. Israeli athletes, murdered because of their faith, because they were in the wrong place, because someone thought killing them would send a message. He had killed a man in a tunnel a short while ago, and it had felt like fixing a problem, like cutting out something malignant. The questions about right and wrong would come later. For now, he had work to do. He needed a team. The mission already carried a title, Committee X, a cold bureaucratic label that hid what it really meant: assassination, state-approved killing, revenge packaged in intelligence language. Golda Meir had made it blunt. We'll kill them where we find them, in their beds, in their cars, in their cities. We'll make them afraid to walk outside. To even attempt this, he needed specialists. Shooters who could blend in, bomb makers who left nothing behind, surveillance people who could track a target across entire continents, and above all, operators who could take a life without hesitating and then sleep well afterward. Such people existed. They either step forward or stay away. He would know soon enough. The plane landed in Tel Aviv at sunset. Zamir went straight to the Mossad headquarters, a plain building of gray concrete behind high walls, guard posts spaced every 50 meters. Inside, 3 men waited for him. At the center stood Mike Harari, Kisadon unit commander. 42 years old, compact, efficient, carrying the weight of 14 confirmed kills. Harari didn't joke, didn't smile, he simply carried out orders. Avner Abraham sat close, calm as ever. A man shaped by years of handling things that blew apart if you slipped even a little. An explosive specialist, once with Sayrit Matal, he had taken down ammunition depots in Lebanon and planted mines on dusty Syrian roads where one wrong step meant nothing left to bury. His fingers never shook. His sense of right and wrong bent whenever the mission asked for it. Across from him was a younger guy, maybe about 30, narrow face, thin shoulders, wireframe glasses that made him look like some quiet clerk until you learned what he did. Yuel Ben-Porat, surveillance man, patient in a way that worried people who understood the job. He could shadow someone for 3 straight weeks and leave behind no trace. He switched between 6 languages like it was nothing. He forged papers so clean that even trained labs couldn't pick them apart. Zamir shut the door behind him. Solid door, thick walls, no windows, no chance of a stray ear catching a word. "You've read the briefing," he said. Harari gave a short nod. 12 marked targets, now only 11. 1 was gone already, shot in Munich by German police. 11 left, and all were to be eliminated. Avner Abraham asked how wide the hunt would spread. 7 countries, maybe 8. The men had scattered fast after Munich, and finding them would be half the fight. Ben-Porat leaned in, practical. Political approval, legal cover.
Zamir answered without hesitation. They had both. The Prime Minister had signed off. Anything they did was sanctioned. Any tool, any resource, any sum of money, approved. Their orders came from Zamir alone. Silence settled until Zamir opened a folder and pushed it forward. A dozen photographs stared back. Palestinian men with real names, cover names, old addresses, last sightings. They had planned Munich. Some had fired the guns. Others had built the bombs or mapped out the operation. Every one of them carried blame. Harari lifted a photo. Ali Hassan Salameh, Force 17 commander, guarded by Fatah security. A hard target, but not impossible, just costly. Abraham asked what costly meant. Zamir told him the budget had no ceiling. Swiss accounts, clean money that couldn't be traced. If they needed $20,000, it was theirs. If they needed 50, same answer. Money would never slow them down. Ben Porat studied another picture. Abdil Zwitter in Rome, officially a translator for the PLO, protected on paper by diplomatic immunity. Zamir brushed that aside. Immunity meant nothing now. 11 Israelis had died in Munich, and these men had helped make it happen. They would pay for it. The three looked at each other. They understood what they were stepping into. This wasn't soldier work or intelligence gathering. It was targeted killing across foreign borders, breaking laws they had sworn to respect. Harari broke the quiet. "When do we start?" "Tonight," Zamir said. "Zuader first. Lives in Rome, in an apartment near the Piazza Annabiliano. Walks home every night at 900 p.m., same street, same pattern. No caution, no protection. Easy to reach." "How many people on the team?" Ben Porat asked. Zamir told him the core team would be the three of them with extra support. Surveillance units were already set up in each city. Local Siyanim would handle the quiet work. Cars, safe houses, spare documents, weapons, whatever kept the operation moving. They weren't spies, just helpers who stepped in when asked, leaving nothing written down. "He walks alone," Zamir added. "No bodyguards. The Italians aren't watching him." Harari asked when they were supposed to leave. "Tomorrow morning, first flight to Rome. Each man traveling separately, different hotels, posing as tourists until they met at the safe house." Zamir handed out envelopes. Each one held a fresh identity, Canadian, British, German passports, all flawless, ready to pass any check. They were stepping into another life, and the work would start the moment they landed. They would pick up the weapons in Rome, the same Beretta pistols with suppressors, the same folders of surveillance notes, Zweider's schedule, his contacts, his habits, everything needed for the job. The briefing dragged on for about 2 hours. They went through every point until nothing was left unclear. Routes in and out, backup plans if things fell apart.
How they would communicate, where the dead drops sat, how the one-time pads worked. The pads meant no code could be cracked. Even if someone grabbed a message, it would look like random noise. Harari asked what everyone was thinking. If we get caught, what then? The answer came fast. Israel would deny it all. Whoever arrested them would put them on trial. No extraction, no leverage, no help. So we're expendable, Harari said. The reply was blunt. Everyone is expendable. Only the mission matters. The meeting wrapped close to midnight. All three men walked out on their own paths, avoiding any hint of connection. Zamir stayed in the room. He opened the folder again. 11 faces stared back. 11 planned executions. The work would stretch for months, maybe even years. He thought of the man in the Paris tunnel, the knife sliding in, the blood, the cold routine of it. He had killed before, Egyptian commandos in Sinai, Fedayeen fighters in Gaza, but those were fights, not this. This was tracking people across borders and ending them one by one. Goldir called it justice. Zamir saw it as necessity. Either way, the result was the same. Harari landed in Rome the next afternoon. He wore a gray suit, carried one suitcase, moved like any regular businessman stepping off a plane. Ben Porat came in about 2 hours later through a different terminal. They passed like strangers. No nods, no signals. The safe house sat on the 3rd floor, looking out over a narrow street. The landlord was a Zionist elderly Jewish businessman who minded his own business. He asked nothing and wrote down nothing. Inside the apartment, the weapons waited. 2 suppressed Beretta 92 pistols, extra magazines, Israeli-made suppressors that turned shots into a dull click. Surveillance papers covered the kitchen table. Zeider's picture, his building, his office, his daily route with times and distances, traffic rhythm around him. The watchers had trailed him for 3 weeks. He was a creature of habit. Ben Porat read from the notes, leaves the office at 8:45 in the evening, walks north on Vietnam File, stops at the newsstand, buys cigarettes, reaches home at 9:15. Harari asked where they should take him. Ben Porat pointed to the simplest spot, the lobby. No guards, no cameras, door always unlocked. Witnesses? Maybe. Neighbors could wander in or out, so the hit had to be fast. They went over the building layout, door, lobby, elevator, stairs. Zeider lived on the 4th floor. The lobby was small, with a marble floor and a row of mailboxes. 2 shooters would be enough. Harari made the call. Both wait inside. He steps through the door. They fire. Then they walk out, 1 minute from start to finish. Ben Porat asked about sound. The suppressors would make the shots so soft, most people would think a car misfired outside. The plan stayed clean and simple. Fewer steps meant fewer chances to fail. October 16, 1972.
At 8 in the evening, the team took their positions. Harari and Ben Perot walked into Switter's building as if they belonged there. They wore dark coats that hid everything they needed. Their pistols stayed out of sight, tucked where no one in the lobby would notice. They stood near the mailboxes, acting like they were checking for letters, trying to look bored, like 2 men with nothing on their minds. 9 o'clock came and went. The lobby stayed quiet. 9:15 passed with the same stillness. No movement, no signal. By 9:30, it was clear the target was running late, and every extra minute felt heavier. Harari kept his hand close to his pistol. Sweat gathered on his palms. Any passerby could step through the door. Any curious tenant might ask why they were lingering there. Time itself became a threat. At 9:45, the front door finally opened. Zechter walked in alone, carrying a briefcase and wearing a tan jacket that looked too light for the night. He didn't notice the 2 men near the wall. He moved toward the elevator, relaxed, unaware. Harari stepped forward. Abdel Zekhdar. Zekhdar turned his head. Confusion flickered on his face. Then understanding. Then fear tightening everything. Harari raised his pistol and fired. 3 shots to the chest. Zekhdar staggered, gasping, falling backward. Ben Perot added 2 more rounds. The suppressed pistols gave off sharp metallic clicks, nothing more. In about 4 seconds, it was done. Zekhdar lay still on the floor. Harari crouched and checked for a pulse. Nothing. They walked straight out the front door without rushing. A car waited at the curb. Abraham sat behind the wheel. They got in, and the car blended into the traffic like any other vehicle heading into the night. The first execution of the operation was finished. 10 targets remained. The car turned onto Via Veneto, passing through Rome as streetlights stretched into long blurs across the windows. Harari sat in the back, hands finally steady as the adrenaline drifted away. Ben Perot stared ahead, not blinking, not speaking. Abraham kept the car exactly at the speed limit, stopping at every red light, obeying every rule. The safest cover was to look like no one at all. They left the car in a public garage near Terminal Station. They wiped the handles, the steering wheel, every place a fingerprint might cling. The car was stolen anyway, and the plates were fake. Rome police would need about 3 days to trace anything, and by that time the team would be scattered across 3 countries. Harari and Ben Perot took separate taxis to separate hotels. They would check out the next morning at different hours, head to the airport by different routes, leaving no pattern for anyone to follow. The first phase of the operation was done, but Zekhdar had only been the beginning. In Tel Aviv, at 2 a.m., Zamir received the coded message, "Package delivered." He decoded it twice to be sure, then he opened the file and crossed out Zekdar's name.
10 targets remained. The next was Mahmoud Hamshari, the PLO representative in Paris. He lived on Rue Lycia, apartment 12B, 4th floor. He had a wife and a daughter. The file held their photographs, their routines, the habits that could be used against them. Hamshari was far more cautious than Zeder. He changed his routes. He checked for anyone following him. He had contacts inside French intelligence who warned him when threats circulated. Getting close to him would demand something cleaner, sharper, more precise. Zamir assigned the job to another team, led by Dr. Masib Hanafi, known as the Professor. He was a bomb maker, 63 years old, an Egyptian-born Israeli who had been building devices for Mossad since 1956. His explosives never misfired, never left clues, never revealed the hand that built them. They were exact, quiet, almost elegant in their simplicity. The Professor arrived in Paris on November 20th, 1972, carrying a worn leather briefcase. Inside it was a hollowed-out book. Inside that book lay a pressure-sensitive switch, waiting to be turned into the next step of the operation. Inside the switch sat about 50 grams of Semtex, enough to take a single life in a closed room, but far from enough to damage a whole structure. He booked a room in a modest hotel near the Luxembourg Gardens. Nothing fancy. Quiet halls, few questions, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. He spent the next 2 days watching Hamshar's apartment building from different angles, learning the flow of the place. He noted every entrance and exit, paid attention to when the elevator seemed busiest, and tracked how often deliveries came and went. The building had a concierge, an older woman who kept her post in the lobby from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. She knew everyone who lived there and didn't miss much. Anyone walking past her during the day would be noticed. He accepted that he would never slip by her without being seen, so he shifted to a plan that relied on darkness and silence instead of disguise. He would come late, open the door quietly, leave what he needed to leave, and disappear before first light. The bomb would wait for a phone call. When Hamshari picked up, the circuit would close, and the Semtex would ignite. December 8, 1972, 3 a.m. He stood in front of Hamshari's building. The street was empty, washed by a thin rain that softened every sound. He wore gloves and a dark coat, the lockpick set tucked inside his pocket. The front door used a simple pin tumbler system, nothing unusual. He worked it open in about 40 seconds. The hallway beyond was unlit and still. He took the stairs, one careful step after another, up to the 4th floor. Apartment 12B sat at the end of the corridor. The door carried 2 locks, a deadbolt and a knob lock. He went for the deadbolt first, working slowly until the pins settled into place.
After roughly 5 minutes, the bolt shifted and he moved on. The second lock gave way in about a minute and a half. He eased the door open just enough to listen. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Hamshari and his family slept behind the bedroom door, which was shut. He went to the telephone in the living room, a beige rotary model common in France at the time. He opened the base, exposing the standard parts inside. He lifted out the ringer assembly, took his time fitting the device where it would stay hidden, and attached the simple leads, red to the positive point, black to the negative. The small switch inside would react only when the receiver lifted, closing the circuit the moment someone answered a call. When he finished, he closed the phone again. It looked untouched. Even a careful inspection would have revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The C4X sat tucked behind the old ringer housing. He slipped out the same way he came, locked both locks, went down the stairs, and stepped back into the rain. The whole job had taken about 12 minutes. He returned to his hotel and waited for morning. At 9 in the morning, he walked to a payphone 3 blocks away and dialed Hamshar's number.
The ring sounded once, twice, 3 times. A woman picked up, Hemshar's wife. He hung up at once. Nothing had activated. Something was off. Back in his room, he tried to retrace each step in his mind. The wiring had been solid. The placement had been correct. The switch should have closed. Then he understood the problem. The pressure switch needed more weight to trigger. A rotary phone's receiver was too light. It offered only about 150 grams, while the switch demanded at least 200. He spent the rest of the day rethinking how he would handle that gap and adjusting his plan. He needed a new trigger, something that reacted with much less force. The earlier setup felt clumsy to him, too slow, too easy to fail. En Rue Darren, he found a small electronics shop and bought a mercury switch, a piece simple enough but far more responsive. It tilted with the slightest movement and closed a circuit without delay. That evening, he went back to Hemshar's apartment. The place was empty again. The family had gone out for dinner, which gave him about an hour and a half to work. He let himself in, took out the old device, and put the new one in its place. Now, when the receiver phone lifted, the switch would shift, the connection would finish, and the bomb would go off. December 9th, 1972. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the professor dialed Hemshar's number. The ring sounded only once. A man answered with a simple, "Hello?" The blast followed right away. The call ended in silence. The professor set the receiver down, left the booth, and walked back to his hotel. He packed his things, settled his bill, and headed for the airport. By midday, he was already on a flight to Tel Aviv. In Paris, Mahmoud Hemshari was dead.
The explosion had ripped apart his face, his chest, and his arms. His wife was in the kitchen at the time and survived. His daughter had been at school. The French police collected bomb fragments and noted the mercury switch, the kind used by trained hands. They never found any clear trace of the bomber. They never identified the type of explosive. They never tied the attack to Israel. Zamir crossed off another name. 9 targets were still on the list. The pace of the operation was rising. The teams were moving quicker, pushing harder, caring less about leaving a clean scene. The next target was Hussein Abdelir, a PLO contact based in Cyprus. He stayed in Nicosia in room 212 at the Olympic Hotel. The plan for him was easier: a charge under the bed, set off by remote signal. No need for phone tricks, no fancy timing, just basic wiring and a radio receiver. The team slipped the device into place on January 24, 1973. The hotel barely had security at all. No cameras, no guards, only a bored clerk flipping through magazines and ignoring most of what happened around him. Alshay came back to his room at about 11 that night. He switched on the light, locked the door, and started to undress. At 11:17, the bomb detonated. The blast punched through the floor and the ceiling. Alir's body was scattered in pieces. Death came immediately. 3 other guests were hurt by flying debris. Command judged those injuries as collateral, regrettable but within their limits. In Tel Aviv, Zamir's superiors began to worry. The missions were working, but the scenes were getting louder, drawing unwanted eyes. Reporters were asking questions. Foreign services were watching. Goldmeier called a meeting for January 30, 1973, in her office in Jerusalem. Zamir came. So did Defense Minister Moshe Dan and Aaron Yariv, the former intelligence chief. "The French are pressing us," Mayer said about the Hamshari case. "The device was too advanced. They know it was not random criminals. They think it points to us." Zamir asked, "They already suspect us?" "They suspect everyone," she said, "but yes, mostly us." Dayan leaned closer. "We need to slow the pace, spread the hits out, make them look less connected."
That gives the targets room to hide, time to get better guards, time to vanish, Dan said. It's still safer than letting the world collect proof that Israel is running hit teams across Europe, Dan said. Yariv added a warning. The Americans are uneasy too. They've been asking quiet questions. They know something is moving. They had not stepped up to challenge them face to face yet, but everyone knew that moment would come. The mayor took a long pause before saying anything. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Keep the mission going," she said, "but shift the approach. No more blasts, no more scenes that invite questions.
Turn every strike into something that looks routine, a car sliding off the road, someone drowning, a sudden heart failure, anything that blends in." Zamir shook his head. "That adds layers," he said. "It slows us down. It forces us to use more people and more planning." She didn't budge. "It doesn't matter. We began this for a reason, and we're not walking away. Those men took the lives of our athletes. We'll finish what we started, but we'll do it with more care and less noise." The meeting broke up after that. Zamir went back to Mossad headquarters and gathered his unit chiefs. He laid out the new limits. No explosives, no close-range theatrics. Every action had to be something that any police officer could shrug off as bad luck or tragic timing. Harari frowned. "These staged events take more groundwork," he said. "You need longer surveillance windows, more time on the street, more exposure." Zamir reminded him that orders were orders. "And from who?" Harari asked. "The Prime Minister or some official scared of headlines and backlash?" Zamir brushed it off. "It doesn't change anything. We take the order, we adjust, we keep moving until the job is done." The fourth name on the list was Basil Al-Kubisi, a PLO figure living in Paris. He taught law at the Sorbonne, spoke at seminars, wrote articles. On paper, he looked like any committed academic. Behind the scenes, he handled logistics for Black September. He arranged hideouts, shifted weapons across borders, and helped place new recruits. The team watched him for about 6 weeks. His habits barely changed. Each morning, he left his apartment and walked the same streets toward the university. Same stretch, same timing, 8:30 in the morning, down Boulevard Saint-Michel, moving past the Luxembourg Gardens, then into the campus area. The operation was set for the 6th of April, 1973. 2 shooters were assigned, Harari and an operative named Youssef Romano. They stationed themselves near the Pantheon. Romano carried a suppressed Beretta. Harari carried nothing. He was the lookout. Al-Kubisi appeared at 8:32, alone, holding a briefcase, wearing a gray suit. Romano drifted behind him, roughly 50 meters back, then 40, then 30. Al-Kubisi slowed at a newsstand and bought a paper. Romano kept closing the gap, 20 meters, 15, then 10. He lifted the pistol and fired. 4 shots. Al-Kubisi dropped instantly. The vendor shouted. Romano didn't speed up. He just turned and walked away as if he were heading to class. Harari was already in a taxi 2 blocks over. Romano reached him about 3 minutes later. They told the driver to go to Charles de Gaulle Airport. Once there, they split up, took different flights, different routes. By nightfall, both were far from France. The French police looked into it, but found nothing solid. No useful witness accounts, no shell casings that led anywhere, no clear path to follow. The case was pushed into the unsolved files.
In Tel Aviv, Zamir crossed out another name. 8 remained. Across Europe, intelligence services began noticing the pattern. Palestinian figures were dying in major cities, and every killing looked clean and deliberate. Same level of skill, same kind of planning, same depth of resources. Many suspected Mossad. The French DGSE came to the same conclusion.
The CIA did not need to guess. They had already intercepted messages traveling between Tel Aviv and the teams on the ground. They held photos showing known Mossad officers moving through Paris, Rome, and Cyprus. Yet they kept all of it quiet. Israel was on their side, and the men who had died were tagged as terrorists. Nothing about the situation was simple. Zamir felt the time slipping away. Every operation raised the stakes, and each new killing pulled in more eyes. The remaining names were tougher to reach. Their security had tightened. Their habits had shifted, and several had simply vanished. The fifth man on the list was Dr. Mahmouder, brother of the first one taken out. He lived in Italy before he disappeared soon after his brother's death. Mossad reports later placed him in Libya under Gaddafi's protection. That made him out of reach. So Zamir turned his focus to the sixth name, Mohammed Bahaidia, an Algeria-born operative running Black September's work in France from Paris. He was the most dangerous figure they still needed to handle. He had overseen bombings, kidnappings, and killings across Europe. He stayed sharp, suspicious, and careful to the point of obsession. Bahaidia switched apartments every 2 weeks. He kept 5 cars in rotation. He never used the same meeting place twice. He checked his vehicles daily to make sure no one had planted anything on them. He lived as if someone watched him at all hours, and he was not wrong. The surveillance team tracked him for about 3 months. They logged his routes, who he spoke to, and the safe spots he trusted. Slowly, they spotted one opening, his mistress, a French actress named Christine Rayo. He showed up at her place in the 14th arrondissement every Thursday night at the same hour. But they couldn't act there. Too many possible witnesses, too many ways for him to slip out. They needed another angle. Their attention shifted to his cars. One of them, a white Renault 16, turned into the weak point. He parked it on different streets, though always close enough to walk from wherever he was staying. That routine made the car the most exposed part of his life. The bomb maker for the job was Rafi Eaton, a former Shin Bet man known for helping capture Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. By then, he spent his days building devices meant to pass for harmless machine parts, the kind no one would notice unless the whole vehicle was torn apart. Eaton landed in Paris on June 20, 1973, carrying a pressure-release device meant to go under the driver's seat.
It relied on a simple idea. The weight of a person held the trigger in place, and once that weight lifted, a short delay followed before the blast. To outsiders, the result would look like a sudden mechanical failure, not a planned killing. On June 28, 1973, the team found Baudia's Renault in Rue de Faux Saint-Jacques, near the Pantheon. The area was calm, mostly homes, with light traffic. At 4 in the morning, Eaton walked there, taking advantage of the empty street. He slid under the car, reached the frame beneath the driver's seat, and put the device in place. He worked fast and quiet, leaving no sign of what he had done. When he walked away a few minutes later, the car looked untouched, but it was now set to react only when the driver returned. By noon, Baudia came back to the Renault, unaware that the car he trusted most was waiting on him. He went through his routine security sweep in the same steady way he always did. He circled the car, checked under it with a small flashlight, and took a slow look inside the wheel wells. Nothing stood out. The device sat deep in the seat frame, tucked into a dark pocket of metal where no quick inspection could catch it. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and eased the car onto the street. After driving about 3 blocks, he pulled up near a small cafe, parked, and stepped out. The blast hit the moment he closed the door. The explosion ripped straight through the seat and punched upward through the roof. A heavy shockwave rolled across the street and smashed windows on both sides.
Bodia was hurled almost 15 meters, his body hitting the pavement lifeless before it even touched down. French police reached the scene within minutes. Where the car had been, there was only a blackened pit, scattered metal chunks, strips of burned rubber, and traces of chemicals. The investigators called it a car bomb right away. It was clean work, done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. There were no suspects, no tips, no useful clues. Zamir drew a line through Bodia's name. 7 targets were left, yet the mission was about to hit its first major setback. The 7th name was Ali Hassan Salameh, the Force 17 commander and the planner behind Munich. He was the top priority, the hardest to reach and the most secure. In Beirut, he lived behind layers of PLO protection, surrounded by armed guards. He used armored cars, changed his routes often, and kept his circle tight. Mossad spent months studying his movements, watching for any pattern he might slip into. They eventually learned he was preparing for a trip to Europe, to Norway. He planned to meet PLO contacts in Lillehammer, a small town north of Oslo, sometime in July 1973. Zamir chose his strongest team for the job, 6 trained operatives, people good with surveillance, communications, and 2 shooters for the final step. They traveled into Norway on separate tourist visas using clean passports.
Once in Lillehammer, they rented a safe house and started tracking possible targets around the town. On July 20th, they spotted someone who seemed to match the description. Dark hair, mustache, fit build. He stayed at a hotel close to the center and moved with 2 men who looked like guards. It fit well enough. Dan Erbel, the team leader, had spent more than 15 years running operations in Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad. He worked carefully and usually checked every detail. This time, he let a few things slide. Instead of confirming the identity through solid proof, he relied on a look, on behavior patterns, on the fact that the man met with known PLO figures. For him, that was enough. On July 21, 1973, the team shadowed the man to a movie theater. He arrived with a pregnant woman. They watched a film and walked out around 10 at night, heading toward a bus stop. The shooters, Marianne Gladnikoff and Dan Erbel, moved into place behind them. Erbel fired first, 2 shots. The man went down. Gladnikoff added 3 more. The woman screamed and threw herself over his body. The team rushed to the getaway car and sped north, planning to reach Sweden and vanish across the border. But Norwegian police reacted quicker than they expected. Roadblocks went up in every direction. Within roughly 1 hour, 2 members of the team were caught at a checkpoint and taken into custody. The arrests set off a chain reaction. By July 23rd, all 6 operatives were already in custody, taken in one after another. Norwegian intelligence questioned each of them alone. They took their time. They pressed on every detail. The stories the team had prepared collapsed fast. Their passports turned out to be fake. Their papers were forged. Nothing lined up. Then the worst part emerged. The man they had killed was not Ali Hassan Salameh. His real name was Ahmed Bouchiki. He was a Moroccan waiter heading home with his pregnant wife. He had no link to terrorism and no link to the PLO. He was simply a civilian walking down the street. An innocent man caught in the path of an operation built on faulty assumptions. The Norwegian government reacted with anger. They realized a Mossad team had been operating inside their borders. They realized those operatives had carried out a killing in public on Norwegian soil. There was no way to hide the scale of what had happened. The scandal hit immediately and spread everywhere. Israel denied responsibility at first, but the evidence was too strong.
Documents, surveillance, witness accounts, it all pointed the same way. Under pressure, the detained operatives finally cracked. They admitted they worked for Mossad. They admitted the mission was real. They admitted Zamir had approved it. 5 members of the team faced trial in a Norwegian courtroom. 2 were found guilty of murder and got 5 years in prison. The rest were given shorter terms.
All of them were eventually released and sent back to Israel, but the damage could not be undone. The mission was blown wide open. Governments across Europe now understood that Israel had been running assassination teams across the continent. The diplomatic consequences hit fast. Norway expelled several Israeli diplomats. France opened inquiries. Switzerland followed. Goldenmeyer called an urgent meeting on August 10, 1973. She was furious. "You killed an innocent man. You got our people arrested. You exposed everything we built." Zamir had nothing to offer in his own defense. He said only that they had acted on bad intelligence, that the team had failed to confirm the target, that the responsibility was his. It was more than a mistake. It was a collapse of judgment that put every part of the mission at risk. European agencies were now hunting Mossad teams. Palestinian figures on the list had disappeared into hiding. The operation could no longer function. 7 names remained, but the list no longer mattered. Europe was no longer workable. The political price was too high. Defense Minister Dayan agreed. All activity had to stop. Bring everyone back. Shut everything down until the storm passed. Zamir asked if that meant letting the remaining targets slip away. Yes, that was exactly what it meant. The meeting ended there. Operation Wrath of God was not canceled, only frozen. The difference mattered. The mission still existed, but it could not move. Zamir went back to his office. The files sat where he had left it. 7 names. 7 men tied to the planning of Munich. 7 men who would likely never stand before any court. He thought about the failures, the rushed decisions in Lillehammer, the assumption that resemblance was enough to confirm identity, the basic tradecraft errors that should never have happened. He also thought about the missions that had worked. 5 men eliminated. 5 threats removed without a hitch. Until Lillehammer, every step had been precise. But Lillehammer changed the entire landscape. Teams were pulled home. Safe houses were emptied. The machinery of the operation went silent. The surveillance operations were shut down. Orders went out. Channels were closed, and within hours the entire network went dark. Safe houses emptied. Phones went silent, and the people who had been watching and listening stepped back. On paper, the mission was finished, but in the shadows, something else continued. The remaining targets relaxed. They let their guard down, slowly at first, then more openly. They believed the pressure was gone. They believed they had outlasted Israel, that the threat had passed, that the long pursuit was finally over. They talked. They moved. They planned. They convinced themselves they were safe. They were not. The operation had not truly ended. It had just shifted into a different phase. This new stage would be slower, more controlled, less visible.
It would wait, it would observe, and when it moved, it would be more deadly than before. Zamir kept the file. Inside were 7 names, written in the same hand as before, still in the same order. He did not close that chapter. He put the folder in his office, within reach but untouched, and he was ready to let time work in his favor. He was prepared to wait years if he had to let circumstances change, to let one small opening appear. When that opening came, the operation would start again. The years crawled by. 1974, 1975, 1976. Governments changed. Wars cooled and flared. New crises pushed old ones off the front pages. But inside Zamir's office, the file stayed exactly where it was. The 7 names remained uncrossed, unmarked, no red ink, no notes in the margins. The operation was officially suspended, but the people on that list were still breathing,
still issuing orders, still moving money and weapons. They were not retired. They were not done. They were planning more attacks. Ali Hassan Salameh was one of them. He had survived. In Lillehammer, he had been the real target. The man who died instead had been a waiter, an innocent bystander who happened to resemble him just enough at the wrong moment. Salameh heard about the mistake. He understood very clearly how close he had come to being the one lying in the street. After that, he changed the way he lived. He upgraded his security, added more guards, tightened routines. He surrounded himself with men and cars and layers of protection. He stopped traveling to Europe at all. No more meetings in European hotels, no more walks in foreign streets, no more exposure to Mossad teams on their home ground. But he made one serious mistake, a personal one. He fell in love. Her name was Georgiana Rizak. She was Lebanese, a former Miss Universe, famous, known, the kind of woman whose face appeared in magazines. She was beautiful and very visible. For a man like Salameh, who depended on staying hard to reach, she was a liability. But she was also his weakness. In 1978, Salameh married her. The wedding was not quiet. It was a social event, something people talked about. Photographs ran in Beirut newspapers. The ceremony, the guests, the reception, the smiles, the couple holding hands. For him, it was a celebration. For Mossad analysts, it was a gift. They cut out the photographs and added them to a new folder. They studied Georgiana Rizak and learned where she lived. Her address was in a particular apartment building on Rue Verdun in West Beirut. It was a wealthy area with good security, guards and gates and people who noticed strangers. Difficult, but not impossible. Through sources and surveillance, they learned Salameh's pattern. He visited her 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, almost always in the afternoon. He arrived in an armored Mercedes with bodyguards and escort cars. The routine was tight, rehearsed, and repeated.
The surveillance team watched him for 6 months. They recorded everything: times, routes, escorts, traffic patterns, backup plans. They learned that the route never changed. The Mercedes came down Rue Verdun, passed the British Embassy, and turned left onto Rue Madame Curie. Every visit, the same path. To make that turn, the Mercedes had to slow. Just for a moment, not much, but enough. That slow turn was the weak point. That was where he could be reached. Zamir took the completed intelligence package and carried it to the Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. Bean had replaced Goldmeier in 1977, and his approach was different. He was more hawkish, more willing to approve dangerous operations if the goal was important enough. Zamir laid out the file, the photographs, the maps, the reports, the background on Salameh. Salameh planned Munich, Zamir said. He has killed more Israelis than anyone else on the list. He is 417 commander. He coordinates security for Arafat himself. Bean listened, flipping through images and pages. "And you want to kill him," he said, "in Beirut, in the middle of a city surrounded by PLO forces." "We have a plan," Zamir replied. "It is precise. It is contained. Collateral damage will be minimal." Bean studied the photographs again. The car, the turn, the apartment building on Rue Verdun, the British Embassy nearby, the likely blast radius, the escape routes, the questions from the international press if something went wrong. "If this fails," Bean said slowly, "if our people are caught, if civilians die, the reaction will be worse than Lillehammer, much worse. We will be condemned everywhere." "It will not fail," Zamir said. "That is what you said about Lillehammer," Begin answered. "Lillehammer failed because we did not verify the target. We moved too quickly. This time is different. This time we have 6 months of surveillance. We have photographs, video, voice recordings. We know his habits, his car, his guards. We know it is Salameh." Bean went quiet.
He held the file closed for a long moment, thinking through everything. The risk, the pressure from within Israel, the families of the dead, the political cost, the message sent by doing nothing. At last he gave a single nod. "Approved," he said. "But this is the last one. After Salome, the operation ends. No more names, no more targets." The 7 names in the file would not all be crossed out. Only one more, but that one would be Ali Hassan Salame. We close this chapter for good. The picture becomes clearer. The team came together in January 1979, 8 operatives in total. The bomb specialist was Erica Chambers, working under a British cover identity while her real name stayed unknown to everyone but her handlers. For more than 12 years, she had built devices for Mossad, focusing on remote detonation systems that relied on radio signals and were known for being hard to detect and steady in operation.
She reached Beirut on January 10th with a simple tourist visa and moved through the airport like any other traveler. She carried 2 suitcases. One held nothing unusual, just clothes and a few basic items. The other carried the pieces she needed: CX, detonators, radio receivers hidden inside ordinary electronic gear. Lebanese customs barely paid attention and waved her through without opening a single case. The safe house sat in the Hamra district, a second-floor apartment rented under a fake name. Chambers stayed there for 5 days, working steadily. She put together a shaped charge of roughly 300 grams, designed to send the force outward toward the street and spare the nearby buildings as much as possible. The trigger system relied on a receiver tuned to 447 megahertz. A transmitter would sit in a parked car about 200 meters away, with a clean line of sight. When Salame's Mercedes passed, the operator would tap one button and the device would fire without delay. Placement mattered more than anything. Chambers picked a light blue Volkswagen Beetle that had been abandoned on Rue Madame Curie for about 3 weeks. The registration had lapsed, one tire had gone flat, and no one had bothered with it. The owner seemed long gone. It made the perfect hiding place. Before dawn on January 20th, 1979, at around 4 in the morning, Chambers walked up to the Beetle. The street around her was quiet. She opened the door lock in half a minute, slid inside, set the device under the driver's seat, fixed the receiver, armed the whole setup, locked the car again, and slipped away. The surveillance crew kept eyes on Salame's habits and pinned down his schedule for Tuesday, January 22nd. He planned to visit Georgina at 2 in the afternoon, following the usual route along Rue Verdun and turning left onto Madame Curie. The operator with the transmitter waited in a rented Peugeot, parked right across from the Beetle. He had an open view of the street. The transmitter rested in a briefcase beside him. One button. Press, release. That was it. 2 in the afternoon came. The surveillance team sent the signal. Target in motion, following the expected path. The operator held his hand over the briefcase. Sweat gathered on his palm. This was the top name on their list, the man tied to Munich, the figure behind the deaths of 11 Israeli athletes. Then the Mercedes showed up, dark blue, armored, windows tinted. It eased into the turn onto Rue Madame Curie exactly as they had predicted. The operator pressed the button. The blast tore through the street. The Beetle exploded in an instant, breaking apart as the shaped charge threw its force sideways. The hit slammed into the Mercedes, ripping through the armor. The car flipped over and landed on its roof. Then fire broke out. Salame sat in the back. The blast had punched through the metal and sent fragments into his chest and abdomen.
He clung to life as his guards pulled him from the wreck. He died on the way to the hospital. 4 others were killed as well. 2 bodyguards, a passerby, and a woman inside a nearby building.
The blast hit harder than anyone on the team had projected. The surrounding damage went beyond what was mapped out. Still, Solomon was gone, and that was the goal. The man behind Munich was no longer breathing. The operator left the Peugeot without hesitation, walked about 3 blocks, and slipped into a taxi that had been arranged ahead of time. Within roughly 1 hour, he reached the Beirut airport. By evening, he was on a plane to Athens, and before a full day had passed, every member of the group had cleared Lebanon. The PLO opened an inquiry right away. Their people sifted through what was left of the scene. They found bits of the device, the radio control unit, traces of C-forks, all pointing to skilled hands. They understood who had done it. They saw Mossad written between every line of evidence, but they lacked anything solid they could bring to the world stage. No documents, no witnesses, nothing that would stand up in any forum. Zamir got the final message that night. He pulled out the file, drew a line through Solomon's name, and stared at the list. 6 names still sat there, but Ben had made his position clear. The mission was done. No more killings, no more pursuit teams. Zamir knew the politics. Israel could not keep running covert actions across the region without paying a heavy price. The pressure was rising, and the blowback was growing. Yet the 6 remaining men had taken part in Munich and had never been held to account. That fact stayed with him, even as he shut the folder and locked it away. Operation Wrath of God had run for 7 years. In that stretch, 6 targets were eliminated, 1 mission failed, and 6 names were left untouched. The real effect reached further than the list. Palestinian operatives across Europe changed how they moved. They watched every doorway. They switched routes again and again. They trusted fewer people. Fear followed them from city to city. That steady pressure, more than any single act, shaped the final outcome. Black September existed only on paper by then. The group had lost its leaders, scattered its members, and seen its support structure fall apart. Munich had taken the lives of 11 Israelis. Operation Wrath of God had taken 6 Palestinian lives in return. The math never balanced, and no one expected it to. It was rough, limited, and for many, unsatisfactory. Zamir stepped away from Mossad in 1974. The person who followed him kept some surveillance in place and held on to certain files. But the line had been drawn. No more executions. That phase of Israeli policy was closing. The 6 untouched targets lived out the rest of their days in different ways. A few died from illness or age. A few were caught in fights among their own circles. A few vanished from public sight.
None of them ever stood in an Israeli court. The Lehammer team served their time in Norwegian prisons. After a few years, they were released and returned to Israel without ceremony. Some went back to intelligence work. Some chose a quiet retirement. None broke silence about what they had done. The families of the Munich victims waited for answers that never came. They wanted open trials. They wanted records, names, judgments. Instead, they saw actions carried out in the shadows. The state never confirmed anything. The silence stayed. In 1976, Goldir faced a direct question from a reporter about Operation Wrath of God. He asked whether Israel had hunted down the killers from Munich. She gave the same line she always used. Israel does not comment on intelligence matters. Then came the follow-up. Had it happened? She did not add another word. I will put it this way. The men who took part in Munich lived with fear every single day until the moment they died. That is the only point I made. The journalist pushed again, asking if that counted as an admission. I told him it was a fact, nothing more. He could interpret it however he wanted. For many years, the operation stayed unspoken, never formally acknowledged. Only in 1999 did former operatives start to talk.
They published memoirs, gave interviews, shared fragments of what had happened. The information came out slowly, hesitantly, piece by piece. It took years before anyone could form even a rough picture of the whole thing. Zavi Zamir never commented in public. He went to his grave in 2012 at age 90 without offering a single official word. The file stayed locked. The full list of targets was never released. Some people were identified with certainty, others remained guesses. No one ever pinned down the exact number of deaths. What people did agree on was the impact. Operation Wrath of God created a pattern that others would later follow. It normalized targeted killings, cross-border operations, state-directed assassination. Other governments studied the approach and copied the tactics. The entire effort became a model. The ethical arguments never reached a clean resolution. Killing without trial, punishment without legal authority, revenge carried out in the shadows. None of it fit into any tidy moral box. Still, from Israel's point of view, the mission worked. It delivered a warning. Strike Israeli civilians and something will come for you. Not right away, not in the open, but eventually, without fail and with deadly certainty. The 6 names that remained uncrossed in the file showed both unfinished work and deliberate limits. The operation could have stretched on. More names could have been added. Instead, it stopped. The killings ended, the story closed, or seemed to. But the story did not really close. That became obvious in 1991, 12 years after Salami's death, 12 years after the mission had formally ended.
A name from the first list appeared again, this time in Tunisia. Atef Basso, PLO intelligence chief. He had been present in Munich, not as a planner or a shooter, but as a coordinator. He arranged housing, transportation, communications, support roles, quiet, but crucial. He had survived Operation Wrath of God because he had been disciplined. He stayed out of Europe, kept a low profile, avoided routines. For nearly 20 years, he remained untouched. Then, in June 1992, he slipped. He traveled to Paris for a meeting with French intelligence, hoping to create a back channel between the PLO and Western governments. The meeting was meant to stay secret, but it did not. Mossad spotted him at Charles de Gaulle Airport. They tailed him to the Meridian Hotel, watched him for 3 days, confirmed his identity, verified his link to Munich. The old file came off the shelf. Approval moved fast. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin reviewed the reports. He had been defense minister during the original operation. He remembered the task, the faces, the purpose. He signed off. On June 8, 1992, Basso walked out of his hotel at 11 p.m., heading alone to meet a contact at a small cafe nearby. The street around him was quiet, mostly residential. Light rain drifted down in thin sheets. 2 gunmen stood hidden inside a doorway, waiting without hurry. They wore dark jackets pulled tight and kept their faces covered so nothing could identify them later. Each held a suppressed .22 caliber pistol. The small round was not an accident. It made little noise, drew less attention, and left a cleaner scene. Easy to hide, easy to slip away. Basso walked by them unaware. The men stepped out with steady movements and opened fire, 11 shots in all. 8 struck his head and chest, enough to drop him instantly onto the wet street. The shooters did not run. They walked off at a normal pace, turned down the next corner, and vanished into the Paris night as if they were just heading home. French police reached the body about 20 minutes later. They collected the spent casings, noted the subsonic ammunition, and recognized the signs of a practiced hit. They had no witnesses, no faces to trace, nothing useful. Soon the PLO announced that Israel was responsible. The French government stayed quiet. Mossad stayed quiet. But the silence carried meaning. Operation Wrath of God was alive again, 2 decades after it first began. The list from back then had never been fully closed, and the pursuit had not ended.
In 1995, another name resurfaced, Maj Del-Majid. In 1972, he had served as a courier, moving messages between Black September groups. He had been a minor figure, yet his name had been entered on the original list. After Munich, he joined Fatah, climbed the ranks, and eventually became a military commander. By 1995, he lived in Damascus under Syrian protection. Israeli teams tracked him for months.
He later died in what officials called a single-vehicle accident. His car left a mountain road, crashed, and went up in flames. Syrian investigators blamed mechanical failure and faulty brakes. The wreck was so burned that nothing could be proven. Yet brake lines never cut themselves, and cars do not erupt on impact unless someone makes sure they will. The timing felt too precise, too neat, too final. Only 5 names from the old file remained, but those men were aging out of the struggle. They had retired, lost influence, and no longer posed much danger. Priorities had shifted. The mission had changed shape. Still, the kind of work launched after Munich did not stop. Through the following decades, Israeli targeted killings continued with new objectives and new enemies, but the structure stayed familiar. Operation Wrath of God had set the model. In 2010, Mahmoud al-Mabou was killed in Dubai. He was a Hamas military commander and a weapons courier. He died inside his hotel room, electrocuted and suffocated with clinical precision. 27 Mossad operatives took part. Security cameras captured nearly everything. The Dubai police later released the footage, showing the team entering the hotel, shadowing al-Mabou, entering his room and leaving about 30 minutes after. They carried forged passports from Britain, Ireland, France, and Germany. A diplomatic storm followed, yet the results stood. Al-Mabou was dead, and the method had worked, much like the older operation. Quiet, direct, no admission, no apology. The pattern continued into later years. In 2016 in Tunisia, in 2018 in Malaysia, in 2020 in Iran. Targets were removed, operations exposed, and Israel kept its standard silence. The policy did not change. Israel sent a clear warning: strike at its people or its interests and you would face consequences anywhere and at any time for as long as needed. The legal debate around these operations never settled. Many argued the targeted killings broke international law and clashed with basic ideas of sovereignty, due process, and human rights. But Israel followed its own logic. For its leadership, security outweighed legality, and the idea of necessity shaped every choice. Survival, as they saw it, left no room for hesitation. The United Nations issued statements of condemnation. Human rights groups raised their voices. Several foreign governments voiced objections, yet none stepped in with military force, and none imposed penalties strong enough to change Israel's approach. So the missions kept going. Operation Wrath of God showed a blunt truth. A state could carry out extraterritorial assassinations and still avoid consequences that threatened its existence. The global system would criticize, would launch inquiries, would produce reports, but it would stop there. Other countries took note.
Russia adopted similar methods, killing Litvinenko in London and later targeting Skrapel in Salisbury. Saudi Arabia murdered Khashoggi inside the consulate in Istanbul. Each case had its own details, its own tactics, but the underlying idea was identical. State-directed assassination had shifted from rare exception to accepted practice. The families of the Munich victims watched this change with mixed emotions. Some felt a sense of closure. The men who carried out the killings had been pursued, and in their view, justice had been done. Others felt the opposite. They saw only an endless chain of retaliation, one death leading to another, with no true resolution. The violence never really ended. Anki Spitzer, who lost her husband, Andrei Spitzer, fencing coach, 27 years old,
spent much of her life fighting for legal accountability. She pushed for trials, for public hearings, for a process that matched her idea of justice. In a 2012 interview, she explained her stance plainly. She had wanted the perpetrators in a courtroom, facing evidence and judgment in the open. Instead, they died in alleyways and on unmarked roads. To her, that was not justice at all, only revenge dressed up as necessity. But others in the Munich community disagreed. Alana Romano, whose husband, Yusuf, a weightlifter, 32 years old, father of 3, supported Operation Wrath of God without hesitation. She believed the men who killed her husband had forfeited their right to mercy. In her view, they got exactly what they deserved, and she wished the team had managed to reach all 12 intended targets. The argument between these perspectives never found a clear conclusion. Justice and revenge blurred together. Legal procedure clashed with immediate action. Both positions carried truth, and both carried gaps that could not be filled. A final twist emerged in 2016, when former Mossad operative Michael Harari, aged 92 and dying of cancer, agreed to a last interview. He said he wanted the record set straight. According to him, the team received 6 names at first, then 2 more later, bringing the total to 8. 4 men were still alive, he added, but they were elderly, in their 70s and 80s, and posed no real threat anymore. When the interviewer asked if he regretted the operation, Harari paused for a long time. Then he admitted to one deep regret. Leila Hammer, an innocent man, had been killed because the team failed in the basic duty to confirm its target. That mistake stayed with him. As for the rest, he felt no remorse. Those men planned Munich, he said. They were responsible for the deaths of 11 people, athletes, coaches, ordinary individuals. Someone had to act, and his team acted. Was it worth it? Harari dismissed the question. To him, worth was never the point. The operation existed out of necessity and carried a message that Israel believed it needed to send. If you kill Israelis, we will find you.
And we will kill you. It never mattered how long the process dragged on, because the outcome was what leaders cared about. And yes, the message landed. Black September faded from the scene. The PLO shifted its behavior and moved with more caution. Attacks on Israeli civilians abroad dropped to almost nothing. So the message worked, at least on the surface, but the price was heavy. 6 Palestinian men died. 1 Moroccan who had nothing to do with any of it was killed, and the fallout echoed across governments. There were public condemnations, diplomatic fights, and long prison terms for some operatives who were caught in the field. And there was the quieter cost, the one people avoided naming, the loss of whatever part of our humanity cracked when we accepted the role of executioners. Harari died 3 days after giving that interview. His words were locked away for 5 years and came out in 2021. The recording became the most detailed first-hand account anyone had ever heard from someone who had actually been on the ground, someone who had fired weapons, someone who had lived with the weight of each decision. Even then, the full truth stayed hidden. Israeli archives held the files on Operation Wrath of God under long classification rules. A 40-year seal kept most records closed until 2022. By the time those papers were due for release, every major figure would already be gone. The planners, the shooters, the targets, the witnesses. All of them. What survived was the impact. Operation Wrath of God reshaped modern intelligence work. It made state-run assassination feel like a normal tool of policy. It set patterns that other services still follow. Its methods ended up in training programs across multiple agencies. The tactics were broken down, studied, copied, and refined. Munich had taken 11 lives in a single day. Wrath of God claimed 8 lives across 20 years. The math looked clean, but it never captured the whole story. It didn't create justice. It didn't settle revenge. The dead stayed dead. The wounds stayed open. But the mission did something else. It altered how Israeli intelligence understood its job. Before Munich, Mossad mainly gathered information. After Wrath of God, it stepped into another role: direct action, targeted killing, a tool built for lethal outcomes. That shift shaped Israeli strategy for the next 5 decades. It created a mindset that allowed operations anywhere in the world against almost anyone without waiting for approval from other nations. The hunt after Munich was only part of it. The larger goal was to build a new framework for how the country would act. The last surviving member of the first hit teams died in 2018. No one outside a small circle ever knew his real name. He lived 46 years with an assumed identity, working regular jobs, raising children, blending into ordinary life. The truth of what he had done never surfaced.
In Mossad headquarters, the files stayed the same. 11 names, 6 marked off from the original mission, 2 more crossed out in later periods, 3 untouched. Those 3 names showed the unfinished edge of the operation, the part of the mission that never reached its end. Maybe that was fitting. Revenge never wraps up neatly. Justice never lands exactly right. The dead don't come back. The past doesn't rewrite itself. At some point, someone chooses to stop, to shut the door, to let the cycle end. Operation Wrath of God officially closed in 1992. 50 years after Munich, 20 years after the first kill, the hunt was declared over. The names still sat on the list, but the killing stopped. The influence of the mission didn't fade, though. Its methods stayed in use. Its ideas kept shaping new operations. Its legacy kept moving forward. That mission, aimed at those exact people and meant as the answer to Munich, did not close with triumph or with collapse. It simply ran out of breath. It faded as the years passed, as fatigue set in, as the people involved realized that some losses cannot be balanced out. Some harms stay open no matter what is done, and some debts stay unpaid no matter how many times someone tries to settle them. The 11th Israeli athletes were still dead. The 8 Palestinian operatives were still dead. The 1 Moroccan waiter was still dead. The other unintended victims were still dead. Every person who crossed paths with Operation Wrath of God carried marks from it, whether they showed them openly or hid them, whether they admitted them or tried to pretend they were not there. In the end, that was what remained. The operation reached its goals on the ground, but fell short on any moral level. It shifted the broader landscape, reshaped policies and habits, and yet left the core problem untouched. The violence kept rolling forward. What had once been extreme turned into routine. The killing did not pause. It only looked different. It picked new targets, moved to new places, and came with new explanations. The pattern stayed the same, even as the details changed, and the underlying conflict kept feeding itself without any real end in sight.